When you look back at the Middle Ages, serial killers aren't usually the first thing that comes to mind. But hidden inside one of the earliest medieval chronicles is a case so strange that historians still debate it today. In the year 1119, a Bohemian priest quietly noted a woman who lured travelers off forest roads, and they never came back. It's one of the first recorded patterns of serial murder in Europe, and almost nobody talks about it. Most of what we know comes from Cosmas of Prague's Chronicle, one of the earliest written histories of the Czech lands. In it, he describes a woman who operated along the forest routes outside Prague, preying on travelers moving between villages. According to the Chronicle, she approached people on the road, offered assistance or conversation, and then led them off the main path. Once they were isolated, she robbed them and killed them, leaving their bodies hidden among the trees. The disappearances created local suspicion long before Cosmas wrote them down. Villagers warned travelers to avoid certain stretches of road, and stories spread about people who entered the woods and never reached their destination. The pattern suggests she had been operating long enough for her actions to become known, and for multiple deaths to be linked to her presence in the area. Cosmas gives no name, no exact number of victims, and no explanation of what ultimately happened to her. He simply documented the fact that she existed and that her actions were severe enough to warrant a place in his chronicle. The lack of detail makes her one of the most mysterious early figures linked to repeated murder. And while this case is little more than a shadow in the margins of history, the next century gives us something far more detailed, far more disturbing, and far more infamous. The story of Sawney Bean is one of the most infamous legends to come out of medieval Scotland. According to centuries-old accounts, Bean led a hidden clan that lived inside a coastal cave and preyed on travelers along the roads of Ayrshire. People vanished without a trace. Entire families disappeared, and search parties found nothing. Over time, suspicion turned from wild animals to something far darker. The legend claims the Bean clan ambushed travelers, robbed them, murdered them, and dragged the bodies back to their cave to be butchered. Some versions even include cannibalism, suggesting the family survived for decades by feeding on their victims. By the time authorities supposedly uncovered the cave, they found piles of bones, stolen goods, and remnants of clothing, a grim testament to years of unchecked killing. The truth, however, is harder to pin down. Sawney Bean appears in older Scottish folklore and early printed accounts, but there are no surviving court documents or official records to confirm the story. Historians still disagree on whether he was a real figure or a cautionary tale exaggerated over generations. What makes the case compelling is that, unlike purely fictional monsters, nothing definitively proves he never existed. The story has too many independent retellings, spread across too many centuries, to dismiss outright. And while Sawney Bean sits in that uncertain space between folklore and possible reality, the next century leaves no such doubts. The 1200s give us a figure whose brutality is fully documented, witnessed, and recorded. A case grounded in real medieval history rather than legend. The 1200s introduce a very different kind of killer, not a figure from folklore, but a real historical nobleman whose cruelty shocked even his own era. Ezelino da Romano ruled parts of northern Italy as a Ghibelline warlord, and while medieval politics were already violent, his reputation went far beyond the brutality expected of a feudal leader. Contemporary chroniclers described Ezelino as someone who killed not just for power, but for pleasure. He was known for taking personal part in the torture and execution of prisoners, sometimes ordering entire families to be wiped out over minor disputes or political insults. In one of the most notorious incidents, he reportedly massacred thousands during the capture of Padua, but it was the smaller, more personal killings that defined his infamy. Multiple sources note that Ezelino kept private chambers for torture, targeting individuals who posed no threat to his rule. His cruelty wasn't limited to wartime. Rival nobles, envoys, citizens, and even children were allegedly mutilated or murdered on his orders. Medieval writers struggled to describe his actions without invoking demonic metaphors, insisting that no ordinary ruler behaved the way he did. While he operated within the world of medieval politics, Ezelino's pattern of repeated, personally motivated killings sets him apart from other warlords of his time. His behavior was extreme enough that Pope Alexander IV issued a papal bull naming him a son of perdition, an unusually direct condemnation that reflected both his power and his brutality. By the late 1300s, Europe was becoming more organized in its legal record keeping, and that means this century gives us one of the earliest fully documented serial killers on record. Gilles Garnier lived near the town of Dole in Franche-Comté, and while he was known locally as a quiet, reclusive man, the region soon became gripped by a series of disturbing disappearances. Children began vanishing from villages and forest paths. When their bodies were found, they showed signs of mutilation and partial cannibalism. Panic spread quickly, and rumors circulated that a werewolf was stalking the countryside, a common explanation for unexplained violence in medieval France. The fear grew so strong that authorities issued a decree urging citizens to search for whoever or whatever was responsible. Garnier was eventually captured after witnesses claimed to have seen him dragging a child's body into the woods. Unlike many medieval trials, his case includes specific testimony. He confessed under interrogation to attacking and killing several children. He also admitted to eating parts of the bodies, which reinforced the local belief that he had been operating as a kind of human werewolf. Though his confession came under pressure, the consistency of the accounts, the pattern of attacks, and the surviving trial documents make Garnier one of the clearest serial killer cases of the medieval period. He was convicted and executed in 1573, but the crimes took place during the late medieval era when belief in werewolves was still widespread. The 1400s introduced one of the most infamous figures in medieval criminal history, Gilles de Rais, a French nobleman, war hero, and former companion of Joan of Arc, whose private life concealed a level of brutality that shocked even his own era. De Rais came from one of the wealthiest families in France and held high military rank, but after the war he withdrew to his estates and began spending lavishly on alchemy, theater, and personal indulgence. It was during this period that children from nearby villages started to disappear. Many were last seen being escorted to his castles under the promise of food, work, or gifts. Surviving records from his 1440 trial are unusually detailed. Multiple servants testified that de Rais abused, tortured, and murdered dozens of children over several years. The accounts describe a consistent pattern, luring the victims inside, isolating them, humiliating them, and ultimately killing them. Some bodies were burned, others buried, and servants were ordered to destroy evidence. While confessions in this era often involved pressure, the volume of testimony, the consistency of the patterns, and the physical evidence discovered during the investigation make this one of the best documented serial murder cases of the late medieval period. De Rais admitted to the crimes during the trial and was executed shortly afterwards. Elizabeth Bathory, often called the Blood Countess, was a powerful noblewoman whose crimes became some of the most shocking of the early modern period. Born into an influential Hungarian family, she grew up surrounded by privilege, wealth, and political influence, but her estates later became the center of a series of disappearances involving young girls from the surrounding villages. Witness testimonies describe a consistent pattern. Girls were brought to the castle under the promise of work or education and were subjected to severe physical abuse. Some were beaten, some were tortured, and many never returned home. Servants later testified that Bathory personally carried out many of the assaults, often in private chambers where she had absolute control. Reports from the investigation detail various methods of cruelty, including burning, mutilation, and prolonged physical punishment. When royal officials finally raided the castle, they claimed to have found tortured survivors and bodies hidden within the walls and surrounding grounds. Several of Bathory's servants were arrested and confessed to assisting in the crimes, often out of fear of punishment themselves. Because she belonged to one of the most powerful families in the region, Bathory was never executed. Instead, she was locked inside a sealed room within her castle, where she remained until her death in 1614. Over time, her story became intertwined with legend, but the core pattern of repeated cruelty and the number of victims attributed to her solidified her place as one of history's most notorious killers. Peter Niers was a wandering bandit whose crimes terrorized parts of Germany across several decades. He traveled from town to town with different accomplices, targeting isolated travelers and small groups along rural roads. The attacks usually followed the same pattern: ambush the victims, rob them, and kill them to avoid identification or pursuit. Niers became particularly notorious because of the way his crimes multiplied. Reports from the time described dozens of murders across multiple regions, all attributed to him as he moved between territories. Authorities struggled to track him because he rarely stayed in one place, and he frequently adopted new disguises. His reputation grew as stories of his cruelty spread, especially those involving mutilation and the killing of pregnant women, a detail that made him one of the most feared outlaws of the era. One of the most well-known accounts claims that when he was finally captured, authorities found a collection of preserved body parts among his belongings. Contemporary pamphlets use these details to paint him as a figure almost supernatural in nature, blending crime with fear and superstition in a period when people often saw murderers through a religious or demonic lens. After a long pursuit, Niers was eventually arrested near Neumarkt in 1581. His trial was brief, and he was executed soon afterwards. His crimes later became a loose inspiration for several German folk stories about shape-shifting or demonic murderers, though these tales were exaggerated long after his death. Thug Behram is often named as one of the most prolific killers associated with the Thuggee cult in colonial India. Operating mainly in the central and northern regions of the subcontinent, he and his group targeted travelers moving along major trade routes. Their method was consistent: befriend the victim, gain trust over a shared campfire or roadside stop, and then strike. The Thuggee relied on strangulation as their preferred technique, using a silk cloth known as a rumal. Behram was believed to be an experienced strangler, allegedly involved in numerous killings over several decades. While the exact number often gets exaggerated in popular retellings, British investigations from the early 19th century link him to a long pattern of coordinated murders carried out by organized groups under his influence. Members of the Thuggee operated with strict rituals and codes, blending criminal activity with religious devotion. Behram's name appears repeatedly in the testimonies of captured thugs, many of whom described him as a teacher and leader within the organization. Although some colonial-era accounts inflated events for dramatic effect, Behram's involvement in multiple killings is consistently supported across surviving testimonies. The Thuggee later became the inspiration for various fictional villains in literature and film, including early adventure novels that portrayed them as shadowy assassins lurking across India's roads. Behram was eventually arrested during a widespread crackdown on the Thuggee. He died in custody, marking the end of a career that shaped one of the most infamous criminal traditions of the 18th century. Jack the Ripper is one of the most recognizable names in criminal history. His murders took place in the Whitechapel district of London in 1888, an area overcrowded, poorly lit, and struggling with poverty. The victims were women working on the streets, attacked during the night with a level of precision and mutilation that immediately set the case apart from others. What made the killings especially alarming was the pattern. The murders happened within a tight geographical area and over a short period, each showing similar signs of throat cutting and abdominal mutilation. Several killings also showed indications of anatomical knowledge, which led investigators to suspect that the killer had some experience in surgery or butchery. The case became one of the first media-driven murder investigations. Newspapers published sensational headlines, letters allegedly sent by the killer, and maps of the murder sites. Public panic grew as the idea of a single, unidentified murderer stalking London took hold. The police interviewed hundreds of suspects, conducted night patrols, and even brought in early forensic techniques, but no one was ever charged. Jack the Ripper's identity remains unknown, which helped embed him deeply into popular culture. His crimes inspired countless books, films, and fictional killers, turning the case into a template for the modern serial killer narrative. Most people hearing 20th century serial killer expect names like Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer. But the century's most brutal and prolific murderer was someone many outside Eastern Europe have never heard of: Andrei Chikatilo, known as the Butcher of Rostov. Chikatilo operated across the Soviet Union from the late 1970s into the early 1990s, targeting children, teenagers, and young women. His attacks often took place near train stations, forests, or secluded paths. He approached victims with a calm, almost gentle demeanor, offering guidance, small gifts, or the promise of help. Once they were isolated, his behavior changed rapidly, turning into extreme violence. His crimes involved a combination of stabbing, mutilation, and assault. Many victims showed similar patterns of wounds, which allowed investigators to link the cases long before they identified a suspect. The scale of the murders caused widespread fear, especially because the Soviet authorities initially hesitated to acknowledge the possibility of a serial killer, as it clashed with the state's image of social stability. Chikatilo was eventually caught after a long undercover operation near a railway station, where he had previously found victims. Surveillance officers noticed his unusual behavior, leading to his arrest. During interrogation, he confessed to a long list of murders, providing details that matched multiple unsolved cases stretching back more than a decade. His trial became a major event across the Soviet Union, drawing crowds and intense media attention. Chikatilo was convicted of dozens of murders and executed in 1994, ending one of the darkest criminal careers of the modern era.